The call came at 4:12. The woman said my name like she was reading from a legal file. I almost hung up, assuming it was a wrong number, until she snapped, "If you do not pick up your daughter right now, we will call the police. I have never given birth." Yet, walking into that school office, I found a little girl sitting alone, and every official document listed me as her biological mother. My name is Avery Lewis. I am 34 years old, and I make my living hunting ghosts in the corporate machine. As a financial risk investigator at Northbridge Forensic Advisory, my daily routine involves dissecting fraudulent tax returns, exposing shell companies, and tracking down embezzled funds. I look for anomalies. I look for the moment a story stops making sense. It was a Tuesday afternoon, pushing past 4 o'clock. The Seattle rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown office, blurring the skyline into a gray smear. I was finalizing a risk assessment report, rubbing my tired eyes, when my desk phone rang. The caller ID displayed a local number I did not recognize. I picked up the receiver, expecting a client or perhaps a courier lost in the lobby. Instead, a woman with a voice like dry ice spoke. She asked if she was speaking to Avery Lewis. I confirmed I was. She identified herself as an administrator at Pine Hollow Elementary, a public school out in the affluent suburbs, miles away from my apartment. Then, she delivered a sentence that made the breath catch in my throat. She told me that my daughter had been sitting in the main office for over 3 hours after dismissal, and that if I did not arrive within the next 45 minutes, she would be forced to contact Child Protective Services and the local police department. I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. A cold, cynical laugh almost escaped my lips. I deal with phishing scams and identity theft daily. I assumed this was a new, particularly aggressive tactic. I told the woman firmly that she had the wrong number, that I did not have a daughter, and that I was hanging up. Her tone did not waver. She read back my full legal name. She read my exact home address, including the apartment number. She recited my personal cell phone number, my work extension, and my date of birth. Then, she dropped the hammer. She stated that abandoning a minor child on school property was a serious offense and that the school resource officer was already reviewing the file. Panic, sharp and icy, finally pierced through my professional detachment. I grabbed my coat and my car keys. I told her I was on my way. The drive to the suburbs took nearly an hour in the miserable rush-hour downpour. My mind raced through every rational explanation. The most logical conclusion was a catastrophic clerical error. Perhaps my older sister, Brianna, had listed me as an emergency contact for her child, and the school administration had somehow scrambled the data. Brianna was notoriously disorganized, always jumping from one chaotic life decision to the next, usually financed by my parents. Yes, that had to be it. A sloppy emergency contact form and an overzealous school secretary. I pulled into the visitor parking lot of Pine Hollow Elementary, the tires of my sedan splashing through deep puddles. The building was mostly dark, save for the bright, sterile glow bleeding from the main office windows. I jogged through the rain, pushing open the heavy glass doors, ready to clear up this absurd misunderstanding. I stepped up to the reception desk. The administrative assistant looked up, her expression hard and unforgiving. Before I could even introduce myself, my eyes drifted to the corner of the room. Sitting on a low plastic chair, clutching a faded yellow backpack to her chest, was a little girl. She was kicking her feet nervously, her dark hair damp and tangled. It was not a stranger. It was Rosie, my niece, Brianna and her husband Mason's 7-year-old daughter. Relief washed over me for exactly 2 seconds before the confusion returned tenfold. I walked over to her. Rosie looked up, her big brown eyes widening in surprise. She asked what I was doing there, her soft voice trembling slightly. I told her I was there to take her home. I turned back to the reception desk, forcing a polite but strained smile. I explained to the woman that there had been a massive mistake. I told her I was not Rosie's mother, but her aunt, and that her actual mother, my sister Brianna, must have forgotten to update her pickup schedule. The administrator did not smile back. She gestured toward an open doorway. A man in a tailored suit, who introduced himself as the school principal, stepped out, followed closely by a uniformed school resource officer. The principal was holding a thick manila folder. He placed the folder on the counter and opened it. He said he understood that parenting could be stressful, but lying to school officials to evade responsibility was unacceptable. I felt my blood pressure spike. I demanded to know what he was talking about. I reiterated that I was the aunt. I pulled out my driver's license and slapped it on the counter to prove my identity, thinking this would instantly resolve the dispute. The principal picked up my license, glanced at it, and then looked down at the file. He slid a piece of paper across the counter toward me. It was the official school enrollment application. Under the section labeled Primary Guardian and Legal Mother, my name was printed clearly. Avery Lewis. I stared at it, my investigative instincts kicking in, overriding my shock. I pointed out that anyone could write a name on a form. I told them this was clearly a case of my sister putting down the wrong information. The principal shook his head slowly. He flipped to the next page. It was a certified copy of a birth certificate. The child's name was listed as Rosemarie Holt. The mother's maiden name was listed as Avery Lewis. The document looked entirely authentic. My stomach plummeted. I reached out and touched the paper. The raised seal was there. But that was impossible. He turned another page. A utility bill. A water bill for an address in the school's district, registered under my name. I had never lived at that address. I had never opened an account there. Next was a residency affidavit. It bore a digital signature. The timestamp and the IP log details printed at the bottom indicated it had been signed via a secure portal. The name on the digital certificate was mine. The room started to spin. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what I was looking at. This was not a typo. This was not a lazy sister making a mistake on a Tuesday morning. This was a meticulously crafted, legally binding paper trail. Someone had stolen my identity, constructed a parallel life for me on paper, and used it to enroll Rosie in this highly rated, incredibly expensive public school district. The police officer took a step forward, resting his hand casually near his duty belt. He looked me dead in the eye and said that according to the state, the county, and the federal government, I was the legal parent of the child sitting in the corner. He told me that if I walked out of that door without her, he would be forced to place her in emergency state custody and issue a warrant for my arrest for child abandonment. I was trapped. If I fought them right now, if I screamed about fraud and forgery, I would sound like a lunatic trying to abandon her own flesh and blood. They had the paperwork. They had the system on their side. And worst of all, Rosie would be the one to suffer. She would be handed over to strangers in the foster system tonight, while the bureaucrats sorted out a legal nightmare that could take months to untangle. I looked over at Rosie. She was watching the exchange, terrified, hugging her backpack so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not understand the legal trap closing around me. She just knew she had been left alone for hours, and the adults were angry. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I looked back at the principal. I told him I would sign the release forms. The administrator slid a clipboard across the counter. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely form the letters of my own name. The same name someone else had been using to build a prison out of paper. I signed the release. I took my copy. I walked over to Rosie and gently took her small, cold hand in mine. I offered her a soft smile, telling her that everything was okay and that we were going to get some dinner. We walked out of the school and into the freezing rain. I opened the rear passenger side door of my car for her, helped her into the back seat, buckled her seatbelt, and then got behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, the heater blasting warm air against the damp chill of the evening. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I had just saved my niece from the foster system. But as I stared out into the dark, rain-swept street, the reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was officially, legally responsible for a child I did not give birth to. My sister and her husband had not just asked for a favor. They had framed me. And as I put the car in drive, I realized that saving Rosie was only the beginning. I was going to have to tear my entire family apart to get my life back. The sound of the rain drumming against the roof of my sedan was the only noise inside the cabin for the first 10 minutes of our drive. I kept my eyes locked on the slick, shining asphalt of the highway. My phone rested in the center console, connected to the car's Bluetooth system. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. I pressed the voice command button on the steering wheel and instructed it to call Brianna. The line rang twice before the audio connected, flooding the quiet interior of my car with the vibrant, unmistakable sounds of a resort pool. I heard the upbeat tempo of tropical house music, the splash of water, and the clinking of ice against crystal. Brianna answered with a bright, breezy tone. She said my name with an elongated, sing-song pitch, casually asking if I had picked up the kiddo yet. She sounded completely unbothered, as if she were inquiring whether I had remembered to grab a gallon of milk from the grocery store. I gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my joints ache. I kept my voice dangerously level. I told her that I had picked up Rosie, but only after being threatened with the police and Child Protective Services because her daughter had been abandoned in the school office for over 3 hours. Brianna let out a dramatic, dismissive sigh. She told me to calm down and stop being so theatrical. She claimed it was just a tiny mix-up with the schedule and that the school staff always overreacted. Then, with a casualness that made my blood run cold, she asked me to just keep Rosie at my place for a few days while she and Mason finished up their trip to Palm Springs. I hit the brakes slightly as a truck merged ahead of me. I told her this was not about babysitting for a weekend. I demanded to know why the principal of Pine Hollow Elementary possessed a birth certificate and a sworn residency affidavit naming me as Rosie's biological mother and sole legal guardian. There was a brief pause on the line. I heard Brianna take a sip of her drink. Then she laughed. It was a light, airy sound that grated against my eardrums. She called it a little paperwork tweak for convenience. She explained that their current zip code did not qualify for the Pine Hollow School District, and since my apartment was technically right on the boundary line, they just borrowed my address. I snapped back that borrowing an address was mail fraud, but creating a fake birth certificate with my name on it was identity theft. Before Brianna could formulate another flimsy excuse, a man's voice cut through the speaker. It was Mason, my brother-in-law. His tone was dripping with that specific brand of arrogant condescension he usually reserved for waiters and junior employees. He told me to lower my voice. He said that good schools needed good profiles, and honestly, Avery, I should be thanking them. He pointed out that I lived alone in a sterile apartment, completely obsessed with my corporate job, and that having a kid around might actually teach me how to be a real woman. He called it a crash course in motherhood, courtesy of him and Brianna. My vision blurred with raw, unadulterated rage. I was about to tell him exactly which federal statutes he had violated when a third voice suddenly chimed in. It was Elaine, my mother. My stomach dropped. The call was a three-way merge. She had been listening the entire time. My mother did not sound shocked. She did not sound appalled. Instead, she sounded deeply irritated with me. She told me to stop badgering my sister. She admitted, without a single ounce of shame, that she had known about the arrangement for months. I asked her how she could possibly justify this. I asked how my own mother could sit by while my sister committed a felony using my identity. Elaine scoffed, a harsh sound that echoed through the car speakers. She launched into her favorite monologue. She reminded me that Brianna had a family to support, while I was just a career-obsessed spinster hoarding my salary. She said that being a successful financial investigator meant nothing if I had no one to come home to. She told me it was an absolute honor to help raise my niece, and that I should stop acting like a selfish child and start acting like part of the family. I took a deep breath, fighting the instinct to scream. I articulated my words with razor-sharp precision. I told all three of them that this was not a family favor. It was severe identity fraud and public record forgery. I explained that if this unraveled, I could lose my security clearance, my license, and my career, while they could face actual prison time. Mason chuckled. He told me I was overthinking it. He said it was just a few pieces of paper in a filing cabinet, and that as long as Rosie got into the gifted program, the ends completely justified the means. Brianna agreed, adding that I was always too rigid and needed to learn how to bend the rules. They did not care. They genuinely believed that because I was the unmarried, childless sister, my identity and my legal safety were simply resources for them to harvest. I was about to hang up when a tiny, trembling voice broke the silence inside my car. I looked up at the rearview mirror. Rosie was curled into a tight ball in the back seat. She was clutching her faded yellow backpack against her chest like a shield. Her large brown eyes were wide with unshed tears, reflecting the passing streetlights. She looked at my reflection and asked in a barely audible whisper if she had done something wrong. The air in my lungs vanished. The anger that had been boiling inside me instantly froze. I realized, in that split second, that Rosie had no idea what was actually happening. She had not heard the police threats. She did not know she was a pawn in a massive lie. Looking at her terrified little face, I understood her perspective. She thought her parents were simply out running errands. She thought the school had messed up the pickup schedule. She thought all this yelling was somehow her fault for being left behind. I reached up and tapped the screen on the dashboard, terminating the call without another word to the toxic trio in Palm Springs. The sudden silence in the car was heavy and oppressive. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I adjusted the rear-view mirror so I could see her clearly. I lowered my voice, wiping every trace of fury from my tone. I told her absolutely not. I promised she had done nothing wrong, that adults get confused sometimes, and that we were going to have pizza for dinner. She gave a tiny, hesitant nod and rested her head against the cold window. I kept driving, but my mind had completely shifted gears. The emotional betrayal, the stinging insults from my mother, the sheer audacity of my sister and brother-in-law, all of it faded into the background. My brain slipped out of the role of the wounded family member and locked firmly into the clinical, calculating mindset of a forensic investigator. My family was arrogant, but they were not criminal masterminds. Faking a utility bill was one thing. Forging a government-issued birth certificate, creating a digitally verified residency affidavit, and bypassing the district's strict enrollment audits required significant effort, risk, and likely money. You do not take on that level of federal legal exposure just to get your kid into a slightly better reading group. The risk-to-reward ratio was entirely skewed. Mason was a failed financial advisor constantly chasing the next big scheme. Brianna was drowning in credit card debt to maintain her image. Neither of them cared about education enough to risk a prison sentence. They needed Rosie to be my daughter on paper. They needed the government to believe I was her mother. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through tax codes, dependency exemptions, and asset protection laws. If they dared to alter a foundational document like a birth certificate, they were definitely aiming for a target much larger than a public school slot. They were following a money trail. And starting tonight, I was going to follow it right back to them. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the apartment was completely quiet. I had managed to coax a few slices of cheese pizza into my niece, run a warm bath to wash away the chill of the rainy afternoon, and tuck her into the guest bed with a spare fleece blanket. Once her breathing evened out into the soft, rhythmic cadence of deep sleep, I closed the bedroom door until it latched with a quiet click. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence of my home, before turning toward my office. I walked into the room, turned on the brass desk lamp, and booted up my secure work laptop. The emotional turbulence of the day was completely gone. In its place settled the icy, familiar calm of an audit. I was no longer a hurt sister or a confused aunt. I was a senior financial risk investigator, and my family had just become the target of a forensic autopsy. I started with the foundation of modern identity, the major credit bureaus. Pulling my comprehensive file requires multi-factor authentication, a security measure I thought was ironclad. But as the secure portal loaded, the prominent number displayed at the top of the dashboard made my jaw tighten. For my entire adult life, my credit score had hovered securely above 800. Tonight, It sat at a dismal 590. My eyes scanned the negative impact markers flashing in red across the screen. Over the past 10 months, a barrage of new accounts had been opened under my Social Security number. I clicked into the detailed history, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. There were 3 new premium credit cards, all carrying balances perilously close to their maximum limits. I pulled the individual transaction logs for each card. The line items read like a travel influencer's itinerary, funded entirely by my stolen credibility. There were business-class flights to Cabo San Lucas purchased 6 months ago, a week-long stay at an exclusive desert resort, and thousands of dollars dropped at high-end furniture boutiques in the city center. Then, I saw the installment loan. It was an auto financing contract for an $85,000 luxury sport utility vehicle, originated exactly 4 months ago. The monthly payments were staggering, and the last 2 had been marked past due, dragging my score down with every passing day. I dug deeper into the architecture of their fraud, tracing the origin of the payments that had actually been made on those accounts. They were routed from a digital-only shadow bank account I had never seen before, registered entirely in my name. I bypassed the standard consumer login page and used my professional credential portals to pull the account's routing metadata. This shadow account was the central hub of their entire operation. It was not just a tool to fund their lavish lifestyle, it was a receptacle designed to catch money. Looking at the direct deposit history, I found a sickening systematic pattern. There were regular influxes of state funding categorized as single-mother education subsidies. Even worse, the medical records for the local pediatric clinic were tied directly to this digital identity. Every vaccination notice, every school health form, and every local support program associated with my niece was being funneled directly into this fabricated profile. To the state and the local government, the system saw Avery Lewis as a struggling single parent, and my sister was quietly cashing the assistance checks. The most damning piece of evidence sat inside the federal tax portal. Using a secure access method I normally reserved for unraveling corporate embezzlement networks, I pulled the transcripts for the last 2 years. There it was, printed in stark black and white on the digital document. A child-dependent deduction, maximizing the earned income credit, electronically signed and filed under my identity. They had not just stolen my credit to buy furniture, they had actively defrauded the federal government by claiming my niece as my own flesh and blood on a sworn federal return. Every professional instinct in my body screamed at me to hit the emergency freeze buttons. With 3 simple clicks, I could lock down my entire credit profile, flag the shadow bank account for severe fraud, and initiate a massive federal identity theft claim. My hand hovered over the mouse, but I pulled it back. In my line of work, you do not spook the target until you have mapped every single inch of their network. If I froze the accounts tonight, the digital bank and the credit card companies would send automated alerts to my sister's phone by tomorrow morning. They would panic. They would destroy the devices they used to forge the digital signatures, shred the physical paperwork, and immediately spin a narrative that I was an unstable aunt trying to ruin their lives out of spite. I needed an airtight, undeniable cage before I ever showed them the lock. Instead of shutting their operation down, I started my own preservation protocol. I opened my encrypted forensic software suite. I took localized, time-stamped screenshots of every single transaction, every forged signature, and every IP address log associated with the shadow bank account. I built a massive, chronological timeline on my secondary monitor, visually linking the dates of the credit inquiries to the dates of their luxury vacations. I drew digital red lines connecting the fake utility bills from the school file to the car loan origination documents. I was dissecting their parasitic system piece by piece, locking away the raw, irrefutable data on a secure offline hard drive. It was well past 1 a.m. when I reached the end of the financial labyrinth. I had the mechanics of the fraud perfectly documented, but the underlying motive still nagged at the back of my mind. All of this immense legal risk, the possibility of federal prison, just for some tax write-offs and a leased luxury vehicle seemed incredibly short-sighted. Even for someone as reckless as Mason. There had to be an anchor. There had to be a massive payout they were building toward, something that required a flawless, impenetrable paper trail proving I was the mother. I decided to run a comprehensive sweep of all my digital footprints, including a legacy email check. I logged into an old, dormant email address I had used during my college years, a secondary recovery account I had completely forgotten about and rarely checked. The inbox was mostly cluttered with years of automated spam, save for one unread message sitting at the very top of the queue. It had been delivered automatically just 48 hours ago. The sender was Redwood Legacy Trust Services, an elite wealth management firm known in my industry for handling highly complex, multi-generational estates. My heart began to pound a heavy, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I opened the message. The subject line read, "Verification request for valid guardian of Educational Inheritance Trust. File, Rosie Holt and Avery Lewis." I read the text of the email over and over, letting the words burn into my memory. It was an automated system ping requesting the designated legal guardian to submit their verified tax returns, proof of primary residency, and a clean credit affidavit to begin the massive disbursement phase of a highly restricted educational trust fund. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, the cool blue glow of the dual monitors illuminating the dark, silent room. The scattered, chaotic puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying, perfect clarity. It was never just about getting Rosie into a good elementary school district. It was never just about stealing a few tax refunds or financing a fancy car. It was about the trust. They had built an entire counterfeit existence from scratch, meticulously layering fake government documents, stolen credit lines, and fabricated school records, all to convince a multi-million-dollar wealth management firm that I was the mother, and therefore the sole legitimate controller of the money. They had spent 10 months setting the stage, weaving me into a trap I did not even know existed, and the curtain was just about to rise on their final act. The Redwood Legacy Trust Services email sat glaringly on my secondary monitor. It was a ghost from a past I rarely revisited, demanding my absolute attention. In my line of work at the advisory firm, Redwood was a known entity. They did not handle standard retail retirement accounts or simple stock portfolios. They were institutional wealth managers, the kind of firm that handled generational estates burdened with ironclad stipulations, aggressive legal oversight, and zero tolerance for risk. My maternal grandmother, Eleanor, had been one of their legacy clients. Eleanor was a woman carved from absolute granite. She had built a boutique commercial real estate empire from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail across the Pacific Northwest during an era when women were barely allowed in the boardroom. She was fiercely intelligent, uncompromisingly strict, and deeply paranoid about the squandering of the wealth she had bled to accumulate. She had never trusted my sister Brianna's impulsive, chaotic nature, and she actively despised Mason, seeing right through his slick suits and empty, buzzword-heavy promises. When Eleanor passed away exactly 5 years ago, the reading of her will was a masterclass in controlled chaos. I remembered the day vividly because Brianna had thrown a spectacular, tearful tantrum in the lawyer's office when she realized there would be no immediate cash payout to fund her lifestyle. The bulk of Eleanor's liquid assets, a sum hovering around $3 million, was locked tightly inside a highly specific, conditional educational trust. The beneficiary clause, which the lawyer had read aloud with painstaking clarity, was burned into my memory. The trust was designated exclusively for the first female grandchild in the direct bloodline. The funds were to remain completely frozen until 2 non-negotiable conditions were met. First, the child had to reach exactly 7 years of age. Second, the child had to be officially enrolled in a Tier 1 public or private school district, verified by independent residency audits. My niece, Rosie, had celebrated her 7th birthday exactly 3 weeks ago, and yesterday afternoon, she had been officially registered at Pine Hollow Elementary, arguably the most prestigious public school district in our half of the state. The timing was absolutely not a coincidence. It was a synchronized countdown. The trust was programmed to execute its verification protocol the exact moment those two distinct conditions aligned. Preparing to unlock a phased disbursement structure meant to cover elite tuition, housing allowances, and comprehensive care costs until Rosie turned 21. But Eleanor was no fool. She had installed a legal failsafe, a financial poison pill designed specifically to keep vultures like Mason as far away from the principal balance as legally possible. I logged into a specialized legal database I used for corporate background checks, pulling up the standard administrative templates Redwood used for these types of conditional trusts. The stipulations for the managing guardian were draconian. The adult administering the funds on behalf of the minor beneficiary had to pass a rigorous, invasive financial background check. They required an immaculate credit history, zero active federal or state tax liabilities, absolutely no prior bankruptcies, and a completely clean record free of civil or criminal fraud allegations. I opened a new, encrypted search window and ran my brother-in-law's legal name through the county civil dockets. The system churned for less than 40 seconds before the results populated the screen. Mason was currently the primary defendant in a massive civil litigation suit filed exactly 8 months ago. A group of local orthodontists was suing him for breach of fiduciary duty and gross negligence regarding a failed commercial real estate syndicate he had aggressively pitched to them. The financial damages they were seeking would completely obliterate his supposed net worth. Next, I ran my sister's name through the federal bankruptcy court database. There it was, sitting in plain sight. A Chapter 13 personal bankruptcy petition, filed but currently stalled in a procedural dispute, entirely masking her staggering mountain of unsecured consumer debt. They were financially radioactive. If Redwood ran even a basic preliminary background check on Brianna and Mason, the trust administrators would immediately freeze the assets. They would likely petition the probate court to appoint an independent, third-party fiduciary to manage Rosie's money, locking my sister and brother-in-law out completely. They would never see a single dime of Eleanor's fortune. So they needed a proxy. They needed a pristine financial vessel. They needed someone with an immaculate background, a high-level corporate security clearance, and absolutely zero red flags. They needed a legal shell to absorb the intense scrutiny of a multi-million-dollar wealth management firm. They needed me. The sheer scale of their sociopathy settled over me, chilling me to the bone. The fraudulent school enrollment was not just about getting Rosie into a nice classroom with a better reading program. The stolen tax deductions and the fake child support accounts were not just acts of petty theft. It was an entire ecosystem of deceit. They were building a synchronized, impenetrable identity chain. Redwood would inevitably cross-reference the school records, the federal tax returns, and the banking history. If every single government and private institution pointed uniformly to Avery Lewis as the custodial mother, Redwood would rubber stamp the approval. The trust would release the funds into that digital shadow bank account they controlled, and they would systematically drain my grandmother's legacy to pay off Mason's lawsuit and fund Brianna's relentless delusions of grandeur. A cold, terrifying reality washed over me as I stared at the interconnected web of lies on my monitors. I was sitting directly in the center of a perfectly constructed legal bear trap. If I acted on impulse right now, if I picked up my phone and screamed fraud to the police or to Redwood, I would instantly trigger my own destruction. The justice system currently viewed me as the sole architect of this massive deception. My legal name was on the digital signatures. My home address was on the sworn utility bills. The federal tax returns claiming the dependent credit were filed under my Social Security number. If I blew the whistle without a flawless, bulletproof counter-narrative, Mason would simply hire a vicious white-collar defense attorney. He would spin a tragic story, claiming I was a financially abusive, mentally unstable aunt who stole their child's identity to capture the trust fund for myself. The authorities would look at the extensive paper trail, look at my high-level forensic financial expertise, and logically conclude that I was the only person capable of executing such a sophisticated, multi-layered scheme. I would go to federal prison for a very long time. My career would be ashes, and Rosie would be left entirely at their mercy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the solid wood of my desk, pressing the heels of my hands deeply against my eyes. I had to forcefully suppress every single human instinct that demanded immediate, explosive confrontation. I could not alert them. I could not let them know that I had found the hidden doors and seen the blueprint of their machine. I had to play the long game. My entire strategy had to shift immediately from shock and betrayal to calculated, silent warfare. My absolute first priority was Rosie. She was the innocent asset at the center of this toxic acquisition, entirely vulnerable and completely unaware. I had to ensure her physical and emotional stability before I made a single aggressive move. Once she was shielded, I would build the counter dossier. I would meticulously gather every digital fingerprint they carelessly left behind, every forged timestamp, every hijacked IP log, and every piece of hidden financial ruin in their actual lives. I would let them believe their trap had worked perfectly. I would let them think they had successfully broken me into becoming their golden goose. And then, right when they reached out to finally take the money, I would spring the jaws of the trap backward, snapping it completely shut on their own necks. By 8 o'clock the following morning, I had already drafted a brief, meticulously worded email to my managing director. I requested an immediate, short-term leave of absence, citing a severe and highly complex family crisis that required my undivided legal attention. My boss approved the request within 10 minutes, asking 0 probing questions. He knew my professional track record perfectly well. If I was stepping away from my caseload, the situation was catastrophic. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark, and prepared to step into a completely different kind of investigation. At exactly 10 o'clock, I sat across a vast, polished mahogany desk from Grant Mercer. Grant was a senior partner at a firm specializing in high-net-worth trust disputes and hostile family litigation. He was a man renowned in corporate circles for being entirely devoid of warmth, bedside manner, or patience for emotional theatrics. He was a tactician, cold, methodical, and profoundly pragmatic, which was precisely why I needed him. I slid a heavy encrypted flash drive across the desk. It contained the entire digital autopsy I had compiled the night before. I watched his face closely as he plugged it into his secure terminal. For nearly 45 minutes, the only sound in his expansive corner office was the sharp, rhythmic click of his mouse as he navigated through the fabricated tax returns, the shadow banking logs, and the strict conditional clauses of my grandmother's legacy trust. When Grant finally looked up, his expression was entirely flat, betraying no shock whatsoever. He steepled his fingers, leaning back in his leather chair. He stated that my sister and brother-in-law had successfully locked themselves inside a vault of their own design. By legally establishing me as the mother across state, federal, and private institutional levels, they had surrendered all actual leverage. If they attempted to forcibly reclaim their parental rights or directly access the money now, they would have to openly admit to multiple federal felonies to break the very paper trail they had built. However, Grant leaned forward, his gray eyes pinning me to my seat. He stated with absolute authority that our primary objective, above the money, above the revenge, and above the fraud, was the 7-year-old girl currently drawing with crayons in my spare bedroom under the watch of a trusted nanny I had hired for the morning. Grant explained the brutal reality of the family court system. He said that if we filed a massive fraud injunction today, without preparing a seamless transition of power, Child Protective Services would inevitably step in. The state would see 2 separate, warring households claiming primary guardianship over a minor child. They would not wait to untangle the financial fraud. They would immediately remove the child from the unstable environment. She would be placed in the foster system, subjected to psychological evaluations, and dragged into a brutal, protracted legal war that could last for years. We could not let that happen. Grant outlined the counteroffensive. We needed to construct a 3-tiered evidentiary package that would force a clean, immediate severance. Tier 1 was the systemic identity and financial fraud. Tier 2 was the reckless child endangerment, specifically documenting the fact that they deliberately provided false contact information, resulting in a minor being abandoned on public property for hours. Tier 3, however, was the clincher. We needed them to explicitly incriminate themselves regarding their true motives for the trust fund, preferably on a recorded medium. Grant told me Mason was going to need my signature very soon. The wealth management firm would require a notarized power of attorney or a direct transfer authorization signed by Avery Lewis, the verified guardian, to move the capital out of the trust and into their shadow account. Grant instructed me to give them exactly what they wanted, or at least the illusion of it. I had to become the Avery they expected. The terrified, overly compliant, easily bullied younger sister. He told me to shrink my presence, to act entirely out of my depth, and to let them believe they were winning the psychological war. I left his office feeling a distinct, terrifying sense of clarity. On my way back to my neighborhood, I stopped at a high-end electronics retailer. I purchased 3 high-definition, motion-activated security cameras. They were small, sleek devices designed to blend seamlessly into bookshelves and media consoles, completely unnoticeable unless you were actively looking for a lens. Back at my apartment, while Rosie was engrossed in a cartoon on the television, I began the installation. I placed one on the high shelf in the entryway, angling it downward to capture the front door and the immediate hallway. I positioned the second on the living room mantel, nestled between a stack of hardcover books, and the third atop the kitchen cabinets. This setup gave me a sweeping, overlapping view of the main living spaces where any adult conversation would occur. I purposefully kept the hallway leading to the bedrooms and the guest room itself completely unmonitored. Rosie's privacy and dignity were non-negotiable. These cameras were not for her. They were a perfectly curated stage designed specifically for the predators who were about to visit. The first test of my newly adopted persona came much sooner than I anticipated. At exactly 7 o'clock that evening, the intercom in my apartment buzzed loudly. It was Elaine. My mother had cut her trip short and driven straight from the airport, supposedly to check on the well-being of her granddaughter. I took a deep breath, consciously letting my shoulders slump forward. I rubbed my eyes vigorously, ensuring the skin around them looked red and irritated. I needed to look exhausted, defeated, and entirely overwhelmed by the sudden, crushing responsibility of having a child placed in my home. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Elaine swept into the apartment, her expensive designer coat dripping Seattle rain onto my hardwood floor. She offered a brief, highly performative hug to Rosie, who was sitting quietly on the rug working on a jigsaw puzzle. Then, my mother turned her sharp, calculating gaze directly on me. She suggested, with a tone that brooked no argument, that we step into the kitchen for a glass of water. Once we were out of earshot of the living room, standing perfectly within the wide-angle frame of the cabinet camera, Elaine immediately dropped the concerned grandmother act. She leaned against the cold granite counter, her tone dripping with quiet, condescending menace. She told me she had spoken to Mason and Brianna at length. She said they were extremely disappointed in my hostile, uncooperative attitude on the phone yesterday. She reached out and patted my hand, a gesture that felt more like a physical restraint than an offer of comfort. She lowered her voice to a harsh, hissing whisper. She told me I needed to look at the bigger picture and stop being so incredibly selfish. She claimed Brianna was struggling to keep her household afloat, that Mason had a brilliant commercial investment opportunity that just needed a little bridge capital to succeed, and that my grandmother would have absolutely wanted the family to support each other during hard times. Then, she delivered the exact manipulative line I knew was coming. She looked me dead in the eye and told me not to ruin my sister's entire life over a few meaningless pieces of paper. I forced my breathing to turn shallow and ragged. I looked down at the floor tiles, intentionally refusing to meet her dominant gaze. I let my hands tremble slightly as I gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink. I channeled every single ounce of the raw panic I had felt the day before in the school office, amplifying it, projecting the image of a weak woman who had realized she was utterly outmatched and terrified of tearing her family apart. I told her in a small, wavering voice that I was just incredibly scared. I said the school officials had threatened me with the police and child welfare services, and I did not want to go to federal prison for fraud. Elaine smiled. It was a cold, deeply victorious expression that chilled me to the bone. She stroked my arm, assuring me in a sickly sweet tone that nobody was going to jail. She promised that Mason had an airtight legal plan to handle the trust administrators, and that all I had to do was cooperate quietly when the final paperwork arrived for my signature. I swallowed hard, keeping my head bowed in total submission. I gave her a slow, hesitant nod. I whispered that I would do whatever they needed to make this terrifying situation go away. My mother kissed my cheek, completely satisfied that she had successfully crushed my resistance. She walked out of my apartment a few minutes later, firmly believing she had won the war and secured the fortune. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the first bullet. The text message from Brianna arrived at exactly 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. It was aggressively cheerful, demanding that I bring Rosie to our parents' house in Bellevue for a healing family dinner at 6 o'clock sharp. The final line of the message was a thinly veiled command, telling me to be on time and absolutely not to overreact about our little administrative misunderstanding. I knew exactly what this dinner was. It was a perfectly choreographed stage designed to extract my signature. I spent the afternoon physically preparing for the role Grant Mercer had instructed me to play. I washed my face but applied no makeup, letting the natural dark circles under my eyes show through. I wore an oversized, faded gray sweater and plain slacks, deliberately stripping away the sharp, polished armor I usually wore as a corporate investigator. I needed to look like a woman who had not slept in 3 days. A woman collapsing under the weight of legal terror. Beneath the bulky fabric of the sweater, clipped securely to the center gore of my bra, was a state-of-the-art digital audio transmitter recording every word with crystal-clear fidelity. The drive across the floating bridge to Bellevue took 45 minutes. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates of my parents' neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the ugly criminal reality festering behind my parents' front door. When I pulled into the circular driveway, my stomach tightened, but I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I unbuckled Rosie from her booster seat. My father, Douglas, opened the heavy oak door before I even had a chance to ring the bell. The air inside smelled of expensive roasted lamb and Elaine's suffocating floral perfume. Brianna rushed into the foyer, acting the part of the devoted mother for exactly 2 minutes. She cooed over Rosie, kissing her cheeks, before swiftly steering the 7-year-old into the cavernous living room and sitting her in front of a massive television with a brand new box of expensive markers and a stack of coloring books. With the child effectively neutralized and isolated, the atmosphere in the hallway instantly plummeted below freezing. Elaine placed a rigid hand on my lower back and guided me away from the living room. The adults moved in unison, steering me into the formal dining room. The heavy mahogany doors were pulled shut behind us with a definitive, trapping click. There was no dinner on the table. Instead, sitting directly in the center of the polished wood, was a thick manila envelope and a silver pen. Douglas sat at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, attempting to project a calm, paternal authority. He slid the envelope toward me, his voice deliberately light and breezy. He told me it was just some standard tuition management authorization for Rosie, a simple formality so Mason could handle the school district fees without bothering me during my busy workdays. I pulled the chair out slowly and sat down, letting my shoulders slump. I reached for the stack of papers. My forensic training immediately took over, scanning the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, but my facial expression remained perfectly arranged in a mask of fearful confusion. It was absolutely not a tuition form. It was a sweeping, irrevocable transfer of financial guardianship. Buried in the third paragraph was a direct reference to the Redwood Legacy Trust, granting Mason total, unmitigated proxy rights to request, receive, and disperse all liquid assets intended for the minor beneficiary. They were trying to blindside me into signing away $3 million. I pushed the papers back a few inches. I kept my voice small and wavering. I told them I did not understand these clauses. I said I needed to take the documents home and let a legal professional look at them for 24 hours, just to be safe. The illusion of polite family compromise shattered instantly. Mason slammed his hand flat against the dining table. The loud crack made me flinch, a genuine physical reaction that perfectly sold my performance. He leaned across the mahogany surface, his face turning an angry, mottled red. He dropped his voice into a low, vicious sneer. He told me there was no time for lawyers. He pointed a thick finger at my chest and explicitly laid out the threat. He reminded me that the state tax filings, the single mother subsidies, and the forged bank accounts were all resting solely under my Social Security number. He stated with brutal clarity that if I delayed this process and caused the trust administrators to look closer, everyone knew I would be the one arrested first. He smiled a terrible, cold smile and added that the federal government loves prosecuting wealthy, single corporate executives who steal resources from needy children. I looked at my sister, silently pleading for her to intervene. Brianna simply crossed her arms. She told me to stop being so incredibly selfish and dramatic. She claimed I was trying to ruin their reunion and that Rosie needed stability, not an aunt who wanted to play the victim. Elaine flanked my right side, her voice a sharp hiss in my ear. She said I had always been jealous of Brianna's family. She demanded I sign the papers right now so we could all just eat dinner and pretend this ugly little phase never happened. They were drowning me in psychological pressure, suffocating me with coordinated guilt and outright blackmail. I let my breathing hitch. I coaxed a tear past my lower lash line and let it slide silently down my cheek. I looked completely broken. I wrapped my arms around my own torso and let out a defeated sob. I looked at Mason and whispered that I would sign it, as long as this nightmare finally ended. But I did not reach for his silver pen. Instead, I unzipped my leather tote bag with shaking hands. I pulled out a single, impeccably formatted document. I told them in a terrified whisper that Redwood had sent an automated security mandate to my work email that morning. I explained that the trust administrators required their specific, biometric-coded release form for the proxy transfer, or they would freeze the account pending a federal audit. Mason's eyes went wide with a mixture of panic and rabid greed. He snatched the paper from my hand, scanning the authentic-looking Redwood logo and the complex barcode printed at the bottom. It was, in reality, the decoy document Grant Mercer had engineered. It was completely legally void, but it was designed to look like the final, golden key to the vault. Mason shoved the decoy paper back across the table, tapping the signature line frantically. He commanded me to sign it immediately. I picked up the pen. I let another tear fall onto the polished wood. I signed Avery Lewis on the dotted line, perfectly executing the role of the defeated prey, while the hidden microphone on my chest recorded every single venomous threat they had just made. The ink was barely dry when the paper vanished from beneath my hand. Brianna snatched the decoy document with a predatory quickness, her manicured fingernails scraping sharply against the polished mahogany table. The suffocating, manufactured tension in the dining room evaporated in an instant, replaced entirely by a sickening, triumphant glee. She did not even bother to examine the signature. She simply clutched the heavy parchment to her chest, her face splitting into a massive, uncontained smile. She let out a sharp laugh and looked directly at her husband, her voice vibrating with sheer relief. She practically sang the words, stating that finally the money was sorted out, and she could breathe again without collection agencies calling her cell phone every single morning. I kept my head bowed, my hands still trembling softly in my lap, acting the part of the completely broken younger sister. But beneath the thick fabric of my oversized sweater, the digital audio transmitter was capturing every single syllable with flawless clarity. Mason let out a long, heavy exhale, running a hand through his hair as if a physical weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side cabinet, poured a generous measure of amber liquid into a glass, and raised it toward the ceiling in a mock salute. He took a long swallow, the arrogant smirk returning to his face with full force. He leaned back against the cabinet, completely abandoning the facade of a concerned father managing tuition fees. He looked right at me, no longer seeing a family member, but a successfully conquered obstacle. He boasted loudly, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He declared that this trust fund was going to turn around all of their debt within 48 hours. He explicitly bragged that the massive influx of capital would immediately satisfy the civil litigation breathing down his neck and provide the exact bridge loan he needed to reopen his stalled commercial real estate project. He had just handed me his motive, wrapped in a bow, perfectly recorded for a federal judge. My father, Douglas, who had remained silent during the coercive pressure tactics, finally spoke up. He leaned forward, ignoring my tear-stained face completely, and asked Mason in a hushed, eager tone exactly when the first major wire transfer would hit their accounts. He mentioned that the second mortgage they had taken out to float Mason's legal fees was coming due at the end of the month, and he needed reassurance that the liquidity would be there. Before Mason could answer, Elaine chimed in. My mother walked around the table, placing a hand on Mason's shoulder. She told him that the timeline for the cash was secondary to covering their tracks. She explicitly instructed him to hire a discreet accountant and make absolutely sure to clean up those federal tax files they had opened under my name. She said that now that they had the signature for the trust, they needed to sever my identity from the shadow bank accounts before the IRS noticed the discrepancies. It was a symphony of self-incrimination. They were so blinded by their perceived victory, so absolutely certain that they had terrified me into permanent submission, that they just confessed to conspiracy, federal tax fraud, and the malicious misappropriation of a minor's legacy fund. I pushed my chair back slowly. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, silencing their celebratory chatter. I stood up, keeping my posture hunched and defeated. I did not look any of them in the eye. I whispered that I was going to take my niece and go home. None of them stopped me. They had what they wanted. Brianna gave me a dismissive wave, telling me to drive safely and to text her when we got back to the apartment. I walked into the living room. Rosie was fast asleep on the plush rug, a purple marker still loosely gripped in her small hand. I gently scooped her up, mindful not to wake her, and carried her out into the cold night air. The drive back to the city was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I simply let the rhythmic hum of the highway tires soothe the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I carried Rosie into my apartment, tucked her safely into the guest bed, and locked the door behind me. The moment I stepped into my home office, the fragile, terrified persona dissolved completely. I pulled the small transmitter from my clothing and plugged it directly into my secure, encrypted workstation. I listened to the playback. The audio was pristine. Every threat, every boast, every explicit mention of the tax fraud and the commercial debt was perfectly preserved. I bundled the audio files with the surveillance footage captured the previous evening from the kitchen camera. I encrypted the entire package and initiated a secure transfer directly to Grant Mercer and his digital forensics team. It was nearly 2 a.m, but I knew his paralegals would be waiting for the upload. The forensics team would immediately timestamp the files, verify the chain of custody, and begin drafting the devastating exhibits for the prosecuting authorities. I finally went to sleep, the heavy burden of anxiety replaced by the cold, sharp satisfaction of a perfectly executed trap. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, my cell phone rang. It was an executive administrator from Redwood Legacy Trust Services. The woman on the line was exceedingly polite, confirming my identity and requesting that I come into their downtown Seattle headquarters the following Tuesday to finalize the in-person biometric verification for the educational fund. I confirmed the appointment with calm professionalism. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a text message from Brianna. She ordered me to stay completely quiet, not to answer any unknown numbers, and to simply wait for her instructions while Mason processed the paperwork I had signed the night before. I deleted the message. I knew the hardest part of this war was still ahead. The decoy document Mason was currently holding would bounce back from Redwood's legal department the moment he tried to file it. The barcode was a dead end. When he realized the paper was useless, the panic would set in. And when criminals panic, they escalate. They would inevitably try to use the very identity fraud they had constructed to attack me, likely claiming I was the one trying to steal the child and the money. I had to strike first. I could not wait for them to realize they had been outplayed. I opened a new file on my computer and began drafting the most crucial document of this entire operation, It was a comprehensive, sworn affidavit directed entirely to the State Department of Child Protective Services and the family court system. I laid out the exact timeline of the neglect. I detailed the afternoon Rosie was left abandoned at the school office for over 3 hours. I documented how the adults in her life had actively coerced a 7-year-old child to lie about her living arrangements and her guardianship. I emphasized that she was being used as a financial hostage in an active, multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. I was building a protective fortress around that little girl. By the time Mason and Brianna realized the vault was empty, they would find themselves staring down the barrel of a state-mandated protection order, entirely stripped of the power they thought they held. The heavy, rhythmic pounding on my front door started at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was not the casual knock of a delivery driver or a neighbor. It was the sharp, demanding strike of law enforcement. I walked to the entryway and peered through the peephole. Standing in the fluorescent light of the corridor were 2 uniformed city police officers and a woman in a practical gray pantsuit holding a thick clipboard. The timeline had played out exactly as Grant Mercer and I had anticipated. Mason must have attempted to file the decoy proxy document with the wealth management firm that morning. The moment Redwood's internal system scanned the fabricated biometric barcode, the file would have been automatically flagged and rejected as a fraudulent submission. Facing the sudden, terrifying realization that the $3 million was locked away and his bridge loan was dead, Mason had done what desperate, cornered men do. He went on the offensive. He had undoubtedly dialed the emergency dispatch line, weaving a frantic tale about an unstable, childless aunt who had suffered a psychological break, kidnapped his daughter, and was trying to extort the family fortune. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the practiced calm of my profession wash over me. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. The lead officer immediately stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously on his duty belt. He asked if I was Avery Lewis. I confirmed my identity in a quiet, steady voice. The woman in the suit stepped up next to him, introducing herself as an investigator with the State Department of Child Welfare. She stated that they had received an urgent, top-priority report of a child abduction and a severe mental health crisis occurring at this residence. She demanded to see Rosemarie Holt immediately. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive. I simply stepped back and gestured toward the open layout of the living room. The 3 officials braced themselves for a chaotic scene. Instead, they walked into a perfectly serene environment. The apartment was warm, smelling faintly of the vanilla candles I had lit an hour earlier. Soft instrumental jazz played from the corner speaker. Sitting cross-legged on the plush center rug was my 7-year-old niece. She was wearing a clean set of matching pajamas, peacefully humming to herself as she snapped pieces of a 500-piece coral reef puzzle into place. She looked up at the officers, offered a polite, curious smile, and went right back to searching for a blue edge piece. There was no crying, no barricaded doors, and absolutely no hostage situation. The palpable confusion on the officers' faces was immediate. The CPS investigator lowered her clipboard slightly, the aggressive edge in her posture softening. I kept my tone perfectly professional, the exact voice I used when presenting audit findings to a hostile board of directors. I invited them to step into the kitchen, just out of earshot of the living room, so we could discuss the nature of the false report they had just received. The officers exchanged a look, then followed me to the granite island. I opened the leather briefcase sitting on the counter and pulled out the thick, meticulously indexed binder I had prepared the night before. I slid it toward the investigator. I told them I understood my brother-in-law had likely called them in a manic state, claiming I had stolen his child for a trust fund. I explained that I was not holding a child hostage, but rather shielding her from severe documented neglect and a massive financial conspiracy. I guided the investigator through the tabs. I showed her the official elementary school enrollment file, pointing to the sections where Brianna and Mason had legally designated me as the sole biological mother. I presented the credit reports, the forged tax returns, and the digital logs of the shadow bank accounts. Finally, I pulled out my cell phone and opened the text thread from Mason. Over the last 45 minutes, he had sent me dozens of unhinged, threatening messages, screaming at me to fix the broken proxy form and explicitly stating he would destroy my life if his commercial debt was not paid by Friday. I looked the investigator directly in the eyes. I clarified that I was not alleging any physical violence against the child. However, I emphasized that they had abandoned her for over 3 hours at a public school because they were on a luxury vacation, and they had actively coerced a minor into lying to government officials about her primary residence and her parentage just to facilitate this fraud. The CPS worker absorbed the sheer volume of the paper trail. She asked if she could speak privately with Rosie. I agreed instantly, showing absolutely zero hesitation. I told her Rosie was a smart, sweet girl, and I wanted her to feel completely safe telling the truth. I stood by the kitchen sink with the 2 police officers, who were now casually leaning against the counter, the tension completely gone from the room. We watched from a distance as the investigator sat down on the rug next to Rosie. The conversation lasted for about 15 minutes. The worker kept her voice low and gentle, asking about school, about the puzzle, and eventually about her parents. When the investigator returned to the kitchen, her expression was grim. She closed her clipboard and sighed. She told the officers that the child was in good spirits and showed zero signs of distress. Then, she looked at me and confirmed that Rosie had innocently corroborated the core of my affidavit. The little girl had admitted that her parents frequently told her to say Aunt Avery was her mom because it made the paperwork easier. She also confirmed that her parents often traveled far away and forgot to pick her up, assuming someone else would handle it. The investigator stated that based on the explicit risk of repeated neglect, the verified abandonment incident at the school, and the overwhelming evidence of guardianship fraud, the state was officially opening a high-level intervention file. She explained that under normal circumstances, with the biological parents posing a documented flight and fraud risk, the state would petition a judge for an emergency removal and place the child in a temporary foster facility. Then, she looked down at the forged school enrollment forms and the counterfeit residency affidavit sitting in my binder. A profound sense of irony washed over her face. She pointed out that according to the current active systems of the state and the county, Brianna and Mason had already legally surrendered their primary custodial status to me. The very trap they had spent 10 months building to steal my grandmother's money was now a binding legal reality. The investigator pulled a blank emergency care authorization form from her clipboard. She explained that since I was already recognized by the administrative system as the primary guardian, and since the home environment was clearly safe and stable, I could sign the document right now. This would grant me temporary, unassailable legal custody, acting as a shield that would physically and legally bar Mason and Brianna from coming anywhere near my apartment or the child until a family court judge untangled the mess. I did not hesitate for a single second. I picked up my pen and signed my name on the solid black line. With a few strokes of ink, I took the elaborate paper cage my family had built to destroy me, turned it inside out, and locked them completely out of our lives. With Rosie safely shielded by the emergency protection order, I transitioned from defense to absolute, unyielding offense. The beauty of a paper trail is that it cuts both ways. My family had weaponized the administrative system to trap me, but they fundamentally misunderstood how vicious that same system becomes when it detects a parasite. I was a financial risk investigator. Dismantling fraudulent infrastructure was not just my job, it was my precise area of expertise. Early Monday morning, sitting in Grant Mercer's sleek conference room, we launched the first kinetic strike against their carefully curated public image. We started with the $85,000 luxury sport utility vehicle parked outside their upscale apartment building. Grant's paralegal transmitted the time-stamped police report, my sworn identity theft affidavit, and the emergency custody filings directly to the automotive finance company's fraud division. Lenders do not hesitate when they realize a high-value asset is tied to an active federal identity theft investigation. They initiated an immediate, aggressive repossession order. I did not need to be there to witness it, because the frantic, humiliating reality of the event was perfectly documented in the voicemails Brianna left on my blocked number later that afternoon. At exactly 2 o'clock, A heavy-duty tow truck backed into the pristine parking garage of their building. In full view of their wealthy neighbors, the operator hitched the gleaming vehicle and dragged it out into the street. Mason had apparently run out into the courtyard, screaming at the driver, threatening lawsuits, and waving his phone, only to be handed a formal notice of fraudulent origination. Their mask of effortless suburban wealth was publicly, violently ripped away. While Mason was fighting a losing battle with a tow truck driver, I was systematically cutting off their oxygen. Working alongside Grant, I submitted comprehensive supplementary dossiers to the Federal Revenue Service and the State Department of Anti-Fraud Investigations. We detailed every single misdirected tax refund and every stolen educational subsidy flowing into the digital shadow bank account registered under my name. Banks possess automated trigger protocols for suspected money laundering and severe identity fraud. The moment the federal agencies pinged the digital bank with the official dispute, the bank's security algorithms slammed the shadow account shut. They froze the entire balance. The true devastation of this move lay in my sister's arrogance. Brianna and Mason had been commingling their remaining personal cash with the stolen government funds to hide assets from Brianna's pending bankruptcy case. By freezing the account, I completely severed their access to all liquid capital. Their credit cards were already pushed to their absolute maximum limits. In the span of 4 hours, they went from anticipating a $3 million payday to being unable to purchase a tank of gas. By Wednesday, the collateral damage reached the Bellevue estate. The frantic phone calls from my parents began shortly after breakfast. They bypassed my blocked cell phone and started leaving desperate, unhinged voicemails on my secure office line. My father, Douglas, left the first message. His usual booming, authoritative tone had completely dissolved into a thin, reedy panic. He alternated between cursing my name and begging for mercy. In his hysteria, he finally confessed the terrifying reality of their financial exposure. He and Elaine had not just been offering moral support to Mason, they had legally tethered themselves to his sinking ship. To finance Mason's aggressive legal defense against his former business partners and to float his stalled commercial project, my parents had taken out a massive second mortgage on their family home. They had staked their entire retirement on the absolute certainty that Mason would unlock my grandmother's trust fund by the end of the month. Elaine's voicemail was even worse. She sobbed into the receiver, pleading with me to drop the fraud claims, insisting that we could handle this privately. She screamed that I was going to make my own parents homeless over a petty grudge. I did not call them back. I did not engage in a screaming match. I felt no satisfaction in their terror, only a cold, clinical detachment. I opened my email, drafted a blank message to my father, and attached a single document. It was a publicly available copy of their secondary mortgage agreement, with the default and foreclosure clauses highlighted in bright yellow. I hit send, letting the stark legal reality answer for me. If they tied their rope to a drowning man, I was not obligated to jump into the water to save them. The financial strangulation immediately bred internal venom. The Golden family unit fractured spectacularly. On Thursday evening, my voicemail recorded a call from Brianna that she clearly forgot to disconnect before putting her phone in her pocket. The audio captured a vicious, screaming argument echoing through their apartment. Brianna was hysterically blaming Mason, shrieking that his sloppy paperwork and arrogant attitude had ruined everything. Mason roared back, his voice ragged with stress, accusing Brianna of blowing their cover because she was too greedy and could not stop financing designer clothes on stolen credit. They were cornered rats, tearing each other to pieces as the water rose inside their cage. Friday morning brought the final strategic maneuver. Grant Mercer called me on my secure line. His voice was as flat and emotionless as ever, but I could detect a faint trace of professional satisfaction. He informed me that the time for skirmishes was over. He had officially arranged a formal resolution conference at his downtown office for the following Tuesday morning. He had sent certified invitations to Brianna, Mason, and my parents. The stated agenda was to definitively resolve the disputed guardianship and to clarify the proxy rights for the Redwood Legacy Trust. He told them that an executive administrator from Redwood would be present to finalize the paperwork. They would absolutely attend. Desperation would drive them there. They still harbored a delusional hope that they could bully me into compliance, that they could somehow salvage the trust fund and save themselves from absolute ruin. What Grant did not include in the formal invitations was the rest of the guest list. He had also coordinated with the Federal Financial Crimes Division and the state tax investigators. When my family walked into that boardroom to claim their stolen fortune, they would not be sitting down for a family negotiation. They would be walking directly into a multi-agency ambush. Grant asked me if I was prepared to attend the meeting and face them one last time. I looked over at the living room, where Rosie was happily drawing a picture at the coffee table, completely untouched by the storm raging outside our walls. I told Grant I would be there early. I knew Tuesday would be the day every single mask finally hit the floor, and I was holding the absolute final strike in my hand. Tuesday morning arrived with the harsh, blinding clarity of a shattered mirror. I sat rigidly at the far end of the long glass table in Grant Mercer's primary conference room. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. My family walked in. They looked absolutely hollowed out. The polished, effortless veneer of upper-class suburban perfection they had worn just days ago was completely gone. Brianna's designer blouse was wrinkled, her eyes rimmed with dark, exhausted circles. Mason looked feral, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. My parents, Douglas and Elaine, trailed behind them, looking 10 years older than they had at that catastrophic dinner. They took their seats opposite me, radiating a desperate, toxic energy. A quiet woman sitting in the corner, Grant's senior paralegal, kept her fingers poised over a stenography machine. Mason did not even bother with a greeting. He slammed his palms flat against the glass surface, leaning forward with a snarling, aggressive posture. He demanded that the Redwood executive, who was seated quietly next to Grant, authorize the immediate release of the trust capital. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice booming across the room. He accused me of orchestrating a malicious kidnapping, claiming I had manipulated the state welfare system to steal a 7-year-old child simply to extort my own flesh and blood for $3 million. Brianna quickly joined the offensive, her voice shrill and hysterical. She demanded I drop the insane custody charade and return her daughter by noon, or she would personally see me destroyed in civil court. Elaine cried on cue, begging the room to realize I was just a bitter, lonely woman trying to buy a family. Grant Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt. He simply steepled his fingers and let them talk. He let them dig the hole deeper, ensuring the paralegal captured every single contradictory statement, every absurd accusation, and every desperate admission of their focus on the money rather than the child. When Mason finally paused to take a breath, his chest heaving, the conference room doors opened for the second time. 2 men and 1 woman stepped into the room. They wore dark, nondescript suits, carrying the unmistakable heavy authority of federal law enforcement. The lead agent flashed a badge that caught the morning light. He introduced himself as a senior investigator with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The woman beside him calmly stated she was a special agent with the Federal Revenue Service, focusing on severe tax fraud and identity theft. The silence that crashed down over my family was absolute. It was the sound of a structural collapse. All the color instantly drained from Mason's face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. Brianna shrank back into her leather chair, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I lifted 3 massive, black binders and dropped them onto the center of the glass table. The impact sounded like a gunshot. I looked directly into my brother-in-law's terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the frightened victim I had pretended to be. I told him the first binder contained the complete, undeniable digital footprint of his identity theft, including the forged state registry documents and the counterfeit bank accounts. I pointed to the second binder, stating it held the federal tax fraud evidence, specifically the falsified dependent claims filed under my Social Security number. I tapped the third binder, explaining it was the finalized child welfare report, confirming their deliberate abandonment of a minor and their orchestrated campaign of emotional coercion. Then, I picked up a small remote control and pressed a single button. The high-definition audio from the dining room recording filled the conference space. Mason's own arrogant voice echoed off the walls, explicitly bragging about using the trust fund to clear his commercial debt. Brianna's laughter rang out, celebrating the money. Elaine's chilling instruction to clean up my tax files played with devastating clarity. The recording stopped. The room felt completely devoid of oxygen. The fragile, toxic loyalty of the Golden family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of me. Mason violently turned on Brianna, his voice cracking with panic. He screamed that she was the one who had forged the digital signatures, claiming he had no idea she was stealing my identity to such an extreme level. Brianna lunged forward, shrieking that Mason was a cowardly liar who had masterminded the entire shadow banking setup to save himself from bankruptcy. She openly confessed to the federal agents that Mason had forced her to do it. Douglas and Elaine sat frozen in sheer horror. My father clutched his chest, realizing the federal agents had just heard them actively conspiring to conceal tax fraud. They had bet their home, their retirement, and their freedom on a man who was currently throwing his own wife to the wolves to save his own skin. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. He formally announced the initiation of a sweeping criminal investigation. He informed Mason and Brianna that warrants were currently being executed at their residence to seize all electronic devices, financial records, and physical assets connected to the fraudulent accounts. The Redwood executive calmly closed his leather portfolio. He stated for the official record that due to the overwhelming evidence of systemic fraud, the wealth management firm was freezing all parental access to the Legacy Trust permanently. The only authorized channel moving forward would be the heavily audited, legally sanctioned care account managed solely by Avery Lewis, acting as the court-appointed temporary guardian for the minor beneficiary. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out of the room. I did not look back. I left them surrounded by federal agents, drowning in the wreckage of their own unparalleled greed. The final, binding knot was tied exactly 2 weeks later in a quiet, solemn family court. Because we had preemptively secured the emergency protection order and presented the overwhelming fraud dossiers, the judge swiftly confirmed my status as the lawful, temporary caregiver. The court initiated the formal process to grant me permanent guardianship, citing the absolute best interests of the child. The $3 million legacy fund remained safely intact, shielded entirely for its rightful owner, under my strict, court-monitored supervision. I officially changed my phone number, moved to a highly secure gated community, and severed every single tie to the people who had tried to destroy me. As we walked out of the heavy brass doors of the courthouse that afternoon, the Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving the sky a brilliant, washed blue. I looked down at the little girl walking beside me. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, her small face looking up at the passing clouds. She reached out and wrapped her small fingers securely around my hand. She looked up at me, offering a wide, genuine smile. She said she was hungry, and then, for the very first time, she called me Mom. It was not a title printed on a forged government document or typed onto a stolen tax return. It was a word spoken out of a profound, quiet sense of true safety. We walked down the concrete steps together, leaving the ghosts behind, finally ready to begin our real life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.